Hello and welcome to the Secure Start podcast.
But I actually started my journey the opposite way round and developed my clinical skills through organisational thinking. We think that psychodynamic work, psychodynamic thinking, psychodynamic principles, psychodynamic skills make extremely difficult work in organisations working with distressed people, make it bearable, make it survivable. And so you feel bad quite a lot of the time when you're doing this work. And without any way of making sense of what that feeling bad is, you drown. So that you go off sick, or you leave, you find something else to do, or you become punitive in your response because you're trying to survive. You know, everyone projects. So the adults who work with all of these children, young people and families are not immune to projecting all over the place. Something transformative happens in the internal world through relationship. And I think that what a psychoanalytic training or model, way of thinking and working offers you is some tools to be able to use essentially yourself as the therapeutic tool. Paying close attention to what's happening to us gives you information and data that you didn't have before and you would never capture in a form. So the thing that the psychodynamic model gives you is an opportunity to use how you feel, the experiences you have, to inform your understanding of a child, young person, family, and not only understand them, but then do something with it.
Hello and welcome to the Secure Start podcast. I'm Colby Pearce, and joining me for this episode is a highly regarded of the psychoanalytic community in the United Kingdom. Before I introduce my guest, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that I come to you from, the Kaurna people of the Adelaide Plains, and acknowledge the continuing connection the living Kaurna people feel to land, waters, culture and community. I'd also like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. My guest this episode is Emma Higgs. Emma is a senior child and adolescent psychoanalytic psychotherapist, psychodynamic organisational therapist and psychodynamic psychotherapist living and working in northwest England. She has extensive clinical experience across a range of NHS CAMHS services, including inpatient settings and parent-infant services. Emma began her career at Thornby Hall Therapeutic Community, part of the Pepper Harrow Foundation, where she was first introduced to psychodynamic thinking and practice. Since then, her training in attachment assessment and intervention, infant observation and psychoanalytic psychotherapy has come together to shape her work. She has a particular specialism in working with looked after and adopted children and in applying psychoanalytic principles beyond the traditional consulting room. Alongside her practice, Emma works closely with organisations that support distressed children and families. She has been involved in developing and delivering a wide range of trainings for non-psychoanalytic professionals, helping them to think psychodynamically about their work. This includes bespoke training for social care professionals and the police, with a focus on children's development and the impact of trauma. Emma is especially interested in how psychoanalytic thinking can be used more broadly within support services and in exploring the interplay between the internal world, the external world, and the wider socio-political context. Emma is also the Deputy CEO of the Association of Psychodynamic Practice and Counselling in Organisational Settings, APPCIOS, a charitable organisation dedicated to supporting clinicians and practitioners working with distressed individuals through the application of psychodynamic thinking and skills. Welcome, Emma,
Hi, Colby.
and welcome to the podcast. And I almost got
Thank
through
you.
that without
Yeah,
boo boo. I'll a couple of minor little edits will go in there, and hopefully my head wasn't moving too much because when you cut out those edits, your head suddenly goes chung to a sudden spot. I think
uh,
that's 101 about recording things for YouTube is you should keep
mm,
relatively still.
it's
Yeah.
still.
Yeah. So reading through your bio, you've had quite a diverse uh,
Mm,
career in practice,
mm,
incorporating both work with individuals and work with individuals and families, and work with organisations that support them as well.
mm, mhm,
And
mhm,
on the basis of our prior chat, when we discussed you coming onto the podcast, we're going to focus a bit more this time on the work that you do with organisations.
mm,
Just
mm,
wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the work that you do with organisations and
mhm.
how you came into doing this work.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Um, so I suppose from a psychoanalytic perspective, I came to psychoanalytic thinking through organizations rather than the other way around. So it's quite common for people who are trained psychoanalytically to then go on to think about organizational work. But I actually started my journey the opposite way round and developed my clinical skills through organizational thinking. So I sort of did
Mm,
it the reverse way round. So I suppose my interest really, well, where did it come from? I suppose like everything, your interest comes from your background, doesn't it? It comes from where you start your life. I came from a very working class city, Liverpool, in the northwest of England. Strong cultural ties, strong community ties. So I was brought up with these things being, sort of embedded as being essential and important, really, in the way that you live your life, the way that you thrive, the way that you develop. Of course, it comes with lots of tensions, it comes with lots of complications, it comes with a whole range of emotional experiences. And I think I originally wanted to study art is what I wanted to do, but I was a working class girl, so there
mm,
was no job that I couldn't formulate a job in relation to art. So I studied art therapy, and then from that I got a job in a therapeutic community.
mm,
So I was young, early 20s, just left university. And it was there really that I started to understand psychodynamic thinking, psychoanalytic thinking through the organizational setting, essentially.
mm,
Um, I have to say, it was probably the most emotionally turbulent, bewildering experience that I've had in my whole career,
mm,
working in the therapeutic community. Extremely rich learning, but it wasn't without lots of pain and lots of stress and lots of anxiety. Um, just a highly emotive experience,
mm,
really. I met some wonderful people, and colleagues that I still work with today. So this is going back 30 years nearly. So these are colleagues I still work with today. Um, I suppose it was a unique place. I know that you've spoken to some other um, professionals who've worked in therapeutic communities, and they've described what it's like to be in therapeutic communities. But it's a very unique experience because you're completely absorbed in
mm,
a way of living, really. Um, and I would say a way of living as opposed to you're not learning technique, you are living together essentially.
mhm,
And I just found it fascinating. I found it wonderful. I found that I was I suppose in a sense, my late teens, early 20s, I'd moved out of my community into another community.
mhm,
And although they were using slightly different language, they were using language, well, they were using ordinary language. They were often swearing as well, because it was a large group therapeutic community with 25 plus adolescents, 13 to
Mm.
18. So it was it was a lot of
The
turbulence.
language was colourful.
The language was colourful. But there was psychodynamic and psychoanalytic language, but it
Mm.
felt to me like this was the language of my family, my community. It was language I knew something about, but it wasn't quite described in the same terms. So I kind of found a home there, really.
Mm.
And finding the home in organizational thinking um, meant that I stayed there for quite a long time. I was there for about eight years, maybe 9 years.
Hmm.
Um, and it was from that really that I discovered psychoanalytic thinking, psychoanalytic practitioners as a job. I'd never heard of it before as a job that you could
Hmm.
do. And it was there that I discovered that really. So that's
Mm.
how my kind of interest in organizational thinking came about. And then over the years, I've developed different sort of ways of working, different skills, different applications. But ultimately, that's brought me back to the application into organizational work because that's where my heart is really. That's what
Mm.
I love,
Mm.
is how groups work, how teams work, how organizations work, how people, when they come together, the thing I'm interested in is the psychodynamic practice. What happens when people come together? What
Mm.
happens in the space between the internal world and the external world?
Mm.
So that's what sort of brought me back to organizational thinking. In relation then to sort of how that looks in practice, I suppose it's sort of consolidated into my work in APPCIOS, as you
Mm.
mentioned. So APPCIOS was an organization that was developed around about, it's a charity, it was developed in 2011, I think, 2012. And it came from the therapeutic community tradition, really. And it was essentially developed to give a home to and to acknowledge that there were a whole raft of very skilled psychodynamic practitioners out there that really didn't have a home. They didn't have a sort of psychoanalytic home because they hadn't done a traditional psychoanalytic training. So we're
Mm.
talking now about residential care workers, youth workers, social workers.
Mhm.
And they were very skilled psychodynamic thinkers, but they didn't really have anywhere to belong and to kind
Mhm.
a professional kind of umbrella to sit under. So its function really was two things. One was to provide a sort of virtual community, therapeutic community for professionals who think similarly, who want to think together, a bit of a
Mm.
professional network, support, development for each other. And the other thing that it does is it provides a training in
Mm.
organizational therapy. So organizational therapy didn't exist as a profession until APPCIOS
Mm.
started, really.
Mm.
And what we've managed to develop over the course of the last, what is it, 12 years or so, a bit more, 12, 14 years, is we've developed a profession that is now regulated and registered with the British
Mm.
Psychoanalytic Council.
Mm.
During that time, obviously, incrementally, we've created this psychodynamic organizational therapy training. The idea behind that is that we think that psychodynamic work, psychodynamic thinking, psychodynamic principles, psychodynamic skills make extremely difficult work
Mm.
in organizations working with distressed people, make it bearable, make it survivable, and it allows people to stay and enjoy their work in a very particular way.
Mm.
It doesn't take away how difficult it is, but it allows them to feel like they're contributing good clinical therapeutic um, skills into their contact with very distressed people.
Thank you. There's a lot in there, and I found myself thinking, uh, as I imagine the listeners will be thinking while you were speaking. And um, one particular point that I'd like to follow up on was that that picture that you drew about people who had had a non-traditional psychoanalytic training, who effectively were, notwithstanding the quality of their practice, they didn't
Mm,
have a home as such,
mm,
a collective that they could be part of. I'm just
mm.
wondering why you think it is um, vital, beneficial, helpful to have an organisation like APPCIOS that creates a home for those practitioners.
Mm. Well, I think, I mean, a simple answer, we all need a home.
Mm,
That is essentially what we will talk about. I suspect in a little while when we're talking about looked after and adopted children, we all
mm,
need a home. We all need a place to belong. Our humanity is partly located in our belonging to a community, to a place, to a home, to a family, to a social group of some kind. This is what we will go on to talk about, I think, in
yeah.
terms of the groupishness of human nature and how that sits with and is in conflict with the individual bits
Mm,
of human nature from
mm,
time to time. But this is, it's kind of, it's an essential part of human development and human experience.
mm,
So I think having a home is a really important place, and home, as we know, isn't necessarily bricks and mortar. It isn't a physical
mm,
building. It's partly that, but a home is an internal kind of structure that you feel located somewhere. It's extremely important psychologically for your own mental health, for your own well-being, to be internally and externally located somewhere.
yeah.
So if it felt important to kind of gather together um, a place where people could sort of hang their coat up in a way and say, this is sort of where I belong. It doesn't mean you don't
Mm,
go away. It doesn't mean you don't, nip somewhere else. It doesn't mean that you're not part of other things, but you've got somewhere where you can kind of hang your coat up and say, I've got a place here, and people
yeah.
can understand something about me here.
It's also about professional identity, isn't it?
Absolutely about
Yeah.
professional identity, and
Mm,
psychoanalytic training in particular is it's very rightfully very robust, very stringent. It takes a long time, but typically it's always been available to people from a particular socioeconomic background because it's quite expensive to train. It takes a
mm,
long time. And there's been shifts certainly in the UK over the last probably 30 or more years in terms
mhm,
of that to try and build in a more robust range of people who will get into the psychoanalytic profession. So
mm,
diversity in terms of race, socioeconomic background, etc. There's a big drive to try and, as there are in lots of professions, to try and improve that. But
mm,
nonetheless, it is very expensive as a training, and it. For a long time, it remained the domain of the upper middle class to
mhm,
upper class kind of, usually women,
mhm,
um, because they not always, but usually women. What we found where there was a group was that there were a group of professionals who come from in through a different route. They come in through social work, they come in through residential social work in particular, they come in through youth work, they come in through schools, teaching assistants in schools, those sorts of things, prisons, people who were working with young offenders, for example. So they come in through these different routes, and they would never have even conceptualized of undertaking a psychoanalytic training because it was out of their sort of way of
mm,
thinking, really. However, they happen to be very talented in
mm,
terms of psychoanalytic thinking and psychodynamic thinking, and essentially building relationships with these people who typically the children, for example, in a therapeutic community are not the children who typically would sit in a consultant room for 50 minutes a week. That would not happen. They're not going to sit there and do a therapy in that way. But this group of people has a way of working therapeutically with children that was accessible. It made the therapy accessible to the children.
Mm,
So the important thing was to give a professional identity to that because it was a really
mm,
important profession that wasn't quite captured in the existing structures, really.
mm. And you also mentioned about how having a home for them, for this group of practitioners, um, is really important in terms of making the work, which is very difficult, a bit more bearable.
Mm.
Yeah.
Bearable and survivable, and and essentially that you can do work and not lose yourself.
Mm,
It is very difficult work. You work, I know that you'll know this, but you're working with quite extreme disturbance quite a lot of the time.
mm,
And, the children and young people, families that we work with have had horrific experiences, and they don't know necessarily how to articulate that in a nice, tidied up way.
mm,
They do know how to show, they can show us what it's
mhm,
like, and they usually show us what it's like, and or they make us feel it.
mm,
And so you feel bad quite a lot of the time when you're
mm,
doing this work. And without any way of making sense of what that feeling bad is, you drown. So that
mm,
you go off sick, or you leave, you find something else to do, or you become punitive in your response because you're trying to survive.
mm,
So, so it's really important to not only survive the work, but to kind of find a way to do something with the information you're given,
mm,
as disturbing and as distressing as it is, to make the work survivable, help you to understand that it's not about you necessarily. It's not about me,
mm,
Emma, that it's
mm,
happening to, but it is a really important piece of communication from that young person. And now I can do something with it because I've got
mm,
some tools to be able to think about it in a different way.
mm. It's interesting. I've been talking about this with previous guests for a little while now about how we, in the difficult work, there is a real risk that we resort to habitual approaches to the
Mm.
work, and
Mm.
those habitual processes, and you mentioned it, can be punitive, um, and often are. So people become overly focused on how do we manage the behaviour, and they move away from what is the meaning of the behaviour, what
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
why is it happening, and it's been the cross that I feel like I've borne through the last 30
Mm.
years is to try to
Mm.
help people to understand what's actually going on here.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
And you mentioned that people carry the weight of emotion, and uh,
Mm.
and 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 go on sick leave, leave the work, and so on. Where does that emotion come from, Emma, that they carry?
Well, I think it's a combination for most people. It's a combination of their own experiences, and whatever is, I guess, projected, to use technical language, projected into them, communicated to them might be another way of describing it. Whatever is given to them or put into them is a good way of describing it, from the children, young people, and families that they meet.
Mm,
So it's this kind of coming together of these two internal world experiences, and there's always a bit of an explosion. Something happens.
mm,
Um, Essentially, that is psychodynamic work.
mm,
How do we remain curious about that explosion? What's happened
mm,
there? And how do we unpick what that's about? So I think that it comes from the combination of somebody's internal world meeting your internal world, your emotional experience meeting someone else's emotional experience.
Mm,
And when that's kind of infused with trauma, abuse, distress, lack of trust, hatred, aggression,
mm,
violence, all of the sort of experiences that lots of the people we see will come into contact with and have experienced firsthand.
mm,
When it's infused with all of that, it meets with your internal world in a very particular way. And each of
mm,
us have got our own experiences to kind of um, that can, to a greater or lesser extent, do something with that.
mm.
And
I do,
mostly what you're trying to build actually in this work is clinicians who can develop a bit of an internal muscle to do
mm.
something with those communications. I sometimes say to people, it's a bit like, you do Pilates and you do the plank to kind of build your internal core. I'm not very good at that physically, but
Look, I know
you
what
know,
you're
the
talking about, but I've never done it.
yeah. So, but I hear that when you do Pilates, you can build a strong internal core muscle, and it's essential to have a sort of good, strong internal core muscle. So, this is really about trying to build that psychological muscle
Mm,
um, in individuals, so that when they're given this stuff that is very difficult to absorb, tolerate, understand, that they've got some muscle to do something with it rather than just spit it back out, which is what happens when people. I do have a lot of compassion for people who are working
mm,
untrained in these situations because they're left with no choice but to get rid of it because
mm,
it's awful. It feels
mm.
awful. You feel frightened, you feel terrified, you feel furious, like a hatred and anger that you've never felt before, and you think, I don't know where the hell this has come from. This isn't me. This isn't what I do.
It's come from the child.
Um, yeah, exactly. So it's really, really important that not clinicians, practitioners, sorry,
Mm.
they could be called clinicians, but
Both.
practitioners are really helped to understand that they can do something with
Mm,
this. They're not victim
mm.
to it. They don't have to just get swallowed up under the weight of it.
Yeah. And I think one of our primary human needs, in a way, when the infant is born, I guess they of course they need their parents to keep them safe, look after them, respond to a range of their needs. But
Mm,
they all, in my way of thinking, sit underneath a very a more primary step, which is that the infant needs the adults to understand them, to understand their experience.
absolutely.
And that, to me, that's just so powerful that you have children who have been deeply hurt, who will project their hurt
Mm,
onto the adults around them as a way in which to facilitate being heard and understood in their experience. And they're
mm,
not particularly aware that they're doing it. And it's a disaster when the adults don't know that that's what they're doing.
mm,
So having that understanding of what's really going on here helps people to just step out of my own reaction to the
mm.
work and just
Yeah,
think about what's actually going on here
yeah,
in this dynamic between the children and myself. Mm.
yeah,
And without
yeah.
that, you end up carrying a lot of negative feeling around.
Well, you feel it as if it belongs to you,
Yeah,
and that's the difficult bit. And you do have to feel it to a degree because
yeah,
it's the feeling of it that allows you to do something with it. You can start to
mm,
wrap some meaning around the experience you've been given. But you have to feel it first because that's how we understand what's happening in the world is we feel it in our body usually first. It's just, we are bodily creatures. So,
mm,
the body mind kind of relationship is really important.
mm,
So they have to feel it and not be sort of killed off by it,
mm, mm.
psychologically killed off by
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
So the feeling of it is really important.
Mm. It's interesting. I mean, my career, professional career is as a clinical psychologist, and I came through a fairly traditional
Mm,
clinical psychology training where we were taught, or at least we were led to believe that it was really important to have to maintain a certain amount of professional distance from the experience
mm,
of the client and be really good observers and responders to them without being emotionally involved in
mm,
their life. And I can remember a very early insight that came to me when I worked. My first job as a clinical psychologist was in child protection, and I've kind of never really gotten away from it. Um, and one of my first insights was um, it was my emotional reaction to the work that helped me to be a better
mm.
practitioner in the work, and that I didn't
Yeah,
want to shut that off. I didn't ever
yeah.
want to shut that off. But
Mm,
it's a double-edged sword. You need to have you need to know what you're going to do with that emotion.
mm,
And I'm for
mm,
I don't think I did know for a long time
mm.
because I had
Yeah.
that insight. I plowed on, um, and it's only it can be 10, 15. I had another guest on who talked about, you know, 20, 20 to 30 years into his career, he just suddenly has a heart attack out of nowhere.
Mm,
Yeah.
mm,
So,
mm. Yeah.
and it's a bit, sorry, I don't want to take too much of the floor, but often think there needs to be an ACEs score for practitioners
Mm.
in this work because the consequences of
Absolutely.
ACEs are longer term. Yeah, the
Yeah.
stress, and I think we as practitioners in the work, um, we carry a lot on behalf of our clients. Mm,
I think that's true, Colby. And I think that, the work comes at a cost, but it's also a privilege. It is both those things. I've learnt a
mm,
huge amount from the children and young people and families that I've worked with, and I've been privileged to work with some very distressed people, but wonderful people who've taught me a huge amount.
mm,
Has that always been easy? Absolutely not. Has it come at a bit of a cost? Yes,
mm,
at times it has. And it's given me a great deal as well. It's
mm,
sort of both. What I would say, I do agree with you actually about the sort of impact, and we
mm,
know lots, don't we, about secondary trauma, etc., etc. Whatever sort of terminology we want to use. What I would say is that that is actually why psychodynamic thinking and organizational work is really helpful, because it sort of helps you to do something with the impact so that it doesn't sit in you as if it belongs to you, like I was saying before.
mm,
The professions I worry about most, the professionals I worry about most are social workers and the police, for
mm,
example, residential workers who don't have this kind of support, teachers in schools. I worry about them because they've got no framework
mm,
to process what's happening to them.
mm,
They very rarely get clinical supervision. They very rarely get any opportunities to reflect or think. They've got no sort of theoretical framework to understand some of this stuff. So that actually I think has a bigger impact. And then what you see in those professions is they use all sorts of understandable defensive processes to protect themselves from the impact of what's happening to them. You can't survive it otherwise.
mm. Yeah. It's interesting that you,
Unfortunately, that is happening in mental health, actually, sorry, in the UK at the moment. So I feel, I still work in CAMHS, and I see lots of my colleagues um, using all sorts of defensive practice to manage the impact of what they're listening to day in, day out, every day, the high levels of risk, high levels of suicidality in the young people that they're working with. And they use all sorts of defensive practice. And it usually looks like organizational defensive practice, like tick boxes, risk assessments, forms that they go in with that they use to complete their therapeutic sessions. it looks like that sort of defensive practice so that they distance themselves from the work. But I
Mm,
think to myself, well, how do they survive it otherwise?
mm, yeah, yeah. You've mentioned defensive practices. You've mentioned a number of groups, all of which, as I was going through my head as you were mentioning them, and then you mentioned them, and
Mm.
what are they beyond risk assessments, tick boxes? What do those defensive practices look like? What should people be on the lookout for?
Um, I think things like removing themselves from sessions, so removing the humanity out of sessions with, or contact with children and young people, for example. So going in with forms as if that tells you anything, loads and loads of forms.
Mm,
Um, uh, Being agenda focused rather than curious about what might emerge. I know that that's
mm,
frightening to do, but if you go in with an agenda, you've already applied a set of circumstances to the session. There's nothing for you to learn. And this young person wants to be in touch with a human being, I think,
mm,
not a set of forms. Um, I know why people do it. I think they do it because they feel lost and frightened and
yeah,
out of their depth,
yeah.
understandably. I guess the other thing would be a huge focus on the behavior change, as you mentioned.
Mm,
Let's just focus on the behavior change, or a huge focus on a particular element of the child or young person. So you
mm,
come in through a pathway. So are we treating anxiety? Are we treating depression? Are we treating attachment or something like that? As if there's not an individual with a whole constellation of experiences there, that means that
mm,
they, depending on which lens you look at it through, it's going to fit perhaps any one of those. Who
mm.
knows? Um, so a singular focus rather than meeting a person, an individual.
Yeah, so it's kind of that retreat from truly understanding, truly
Mm,
experiencing what the other person is experiencing.
mm,
We've retreated to perhaps even more so, I think, to a habitual reserve and
mm,
professional distance in practice. I'm wondering about you mentioned also police officers,
mm,
teachers, social workers working, I guess, in local authorities in more generic child protection type roles. What sort of defensive practices do you think
mm,
they themselves and perhaps their supervisors should be
mm.
on the lookout for?
Yeah. I think, social work, if I start with social workers, I think they're completely swamped with paperwork. They're a massively scapegoated profession, so they are always expecting to be attacked, not just from the clients they see, but from our population, essentially. And they are a profession that are usually the ones to be blamed when something goes wrong. So there's defensive practice built in from the start. They're covering their backs
Mm,
from the word go because they've been scapegoated and maligned and blamed for horrific events, but it's not social work per se that's kind of caused that to happen.
mm,
So they're swamped with paperwork and they have developed a kind of hardened attitude, I think, to quite severe distress
mm,
and pain. Um, and they get conditioned to the horror of the stories they hear, and the
mm.
threshold increases. So it's like it's becoming a bit, they become a bit numb to the things that they shouldn't become numb to. So
Yeah,
sometimes I hear stories and feel shocked, and I look around and I think, is no one shocked at this? And sometimes I have to say in a child protection meeting or something, I'm really impacted by that, like I'm really shocked by that. And they might say even, oh, we hear this all the time,
mm,
such and such. And I say, well, you should be shocked. That's
mm,
shocking. you should be shocked by that. That's
Yeah.
an awful thing to
Yeah.
hear. They become a bit desensitized because they have got to survive.
Mm.
So they become a bit hardened. The police different in a way, I would say, Colby. I think this has been one of the very surprising things that I've found in my contact with the police. I don't have a lot of contact with the police in terms of their actual work. And I don't have a lot of contact with them individually therapeutically. I do training with the police. And I had expected a bit of a macho attitude. I suppose this was my bias. I'd expected a bit of a macho attitude, a sort of
Mm.
dismissive quality to emotionality and human experience. I actually didn't find that at all. I
Mm.
found them to be really receptive, very moved by the training that I delivered. They are not taught child development, for example, as part of their
Mm.
training. So then when they see children and families who are traumatized, there's domestic violence or there's child abuse, or they're doing interviews to best evidence interviews and things like that, and they're meeting with children. They've got no context within which to place the experiences they're having with these children and young people, because they've
Mm.
got no understanding of child development other than ordinary stuff that we might pick up along the way, or they may be
Mm.
parents, for example, and have got some sort of understanding of it, but they've got no specific training in relation to the impact of trauma or
Mm.
neglect, for example, and what that might look like. So they're very moved by the training, and it's the that when I deliver that training, I always get police officers coming to me at the end of the training or in the break or something like that, telling me their story, which is
Mm.
very often traumatic, really quite horrific traumatic experiences.
Yeah. They have a lot of problems with retention in police with post-traumatic
Yeah,
stress disorder.
absolutely.
Mm.
And so you can imagine, if you're a police officer with a traumatic story from whatever, whether
Mm.
it's in the job or prior to the job, and you're meeting with a very distressed child who's got a traumatic story,
Mm.
you can imagine where these two things might meet and what that particular explosion might look like.
Mm.
Internal explosion, I'm
Mhm.
thinking about, as opposed to an external one.
Yeah. And
So
teachers,
your capacity to think is gone. Your capacity to do anything is gone.
I often say that, and I've talked about this on the podcast with previous guests, is that what I've observed with social workers in particular in child protection is they stop thinking about the work that they're doing. They
Yeah,
just follow procedure, follow
yeah,
procedure, follow procedure. And a lot of procedure is about how do we manage
mm,
risk,
yeah,
risk management procedures
yeah,
rather than. I just wanted to pop in. I'm going to ask you about teachers as well, the same question in a moment, but I wanted to pop in. I just remembered while we were talking that insight that I referred to earlier. Um, I can't, because it was so long ago, it's 30 years ago. I can't remember the temporality of the two. So I was in a job interview where I was asked about how you manage the feelings, and
mm,
I said, well, if I stop having those feelings, then I think I'll not be a great practitioner. But
mm,
I remember coming in to do an assessment of um, a, a child who was um, under 10, and I came into this is when I worked in child protection, and I came into the office and I went into the first secure area, and in there was this very young and very waif-like, very small
mm,
child, and lots of adults all around at desks and lots of activity, that first thing in the morning activity, drinking coffee and chatting and so on. And the child had been brought in and dropped off by a taxi.
mm,
And I just, that her experience, I mean, it was the
mm,
first thing I acknowledged to her when we went into the room to do the assessment, but that
mm.
that stuck with me for a long time. Her
Yeah,
experience of being collected from home
yeah,
by taxi, a stranger, and brought in and then having to kind of sit and wait for me. And she didn't have to, I wasn't running late. She was just the first person that I was seeing that day. Yeah. And
mm,
I just felt awful. for
Yeah.
how that might have been experienced for her.
Mm.
I also, the
These
other thing that's,
experience, sorry, I was just going to say those experiences are really important, Colby, aren't they? Because, I've
mm,
got similar sort of stories in different places I've worked, really, where, there's certain children, young people, adults actually that I've worked with, families that I've worked with, that will always be in my mind. Like they've sort of lodged themselves somewhere because of whatever's happened in that
mm,
contact that we've had. They will
mm,
always be there and they teach us different things. It's an important thing to hold on to.
I
It's
think
not
so.
always pleasant, they're sometimes painful, but they're really important pieces of information to hold on to.
Mm,
Um, because they help us not only connect with the humanity of what we need to connect with, because that's essential. Um, but they help us understand something about what's being, there's a generosity. I know that it doesn't feel like this when you're on the receiving end of some of these communications, but there is a generosity
mm,
in the, you are being giving a something.
mm,
And it doesn't always feel like that. I'm sort of
mm.
correcting myself as I say it
They're
because I'm
sharing
thinking about some of the
something.
things I've been given. They're sharing something, and um it the thing that they're sharing may not always be wanted by us.
Mm,
And it's got to go, but it's got to land somewhere. Like it does actually need to land inside a person somewhere.
mm, mm,
Otherwise, we end up with all of the things we know about, for example, the prison population, the adult
mm.
prison population. We end up with a population of people who can't use relationships to have themselves understood.
Yeah.
So, so they sort of live in actually going back to where we started, the importance of home. They live in a world where home is is not something
Not
that's
existent.
useful to them at all.
Mm, mm. And teachers are another group that, well, in fact, probably have the most
Mm.
exposure to our troubled young people, and again, also carry a lot of stress, but also carry a lot of responsibility for managing behaviours.
Yeah.
What do you see in terms of those defensive actions, those at work, things that need to be, I guess, recognised, looked at, and understood, and perhaps dealt with in a different way? How do you see teachers responding in a defensive way?
Um, Teachers, I mean, absolutely through behavior management,
Mm,
managing the class.
mm,
Focus on, I don't know if it's the same actually in Australia, but there's a sort of almost um, kind of completely unrealistic being wedded to attainment and attendance in the UK,
mm,
as if they are measures of something. So everything is seen through the lens of attainment levels
mm,
and attendance.
mm,
So the whole of a teacher's job is structured around attainment levels, attendance levels, and behavior. So manage the
mm,
behavior in the class. What do I see them do in practice? I mean, I'm sort of being slightly careful because I don't want to be unfair to teachers, but I actually struggle with teachers more than probably most of the professions because I think they are highly defended.
mm,
I do understand why, but there's a real rigidity around the
mhm.
capacity to see anything through a different lens.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, certainly this is definitely in the UK. I don't know how widespread this is, but teachers are a profession that are under huge amounts of scrutiny
Mm,
in the UK. Ofsted come in and they
mm,
sit in classrooms and there's an atmosphere in the whole profession of judgment.
mm,
You are being measured and monitored and assessed for competency all of the
mm,
time.
mm,
And that is absolutely passed down to the pupils. So, most ordinary kids who come from ordinary backgrounds can kind of suck this up and get on with it and just kind of
mm,
get through the day. And, even then, they have sometimes a bit of an awful time in school. But if you've got a child who, for example, can't learn, not won't learn, but can't learn because, for example, they've had a traumatic early history, there's been lots of neglect or abuse, they
mm,
can't play for a
mm,
start. If you can't play, you can't learn. So they've got no capacity to sort of use their mind. That, they're not relaxed. They're in a completely traumatized state. So you can't learn or play if you're not relaxed in a relatively relaxed state. They feel endangered in those classrooms. It doesn't look like that. I appreciate that. And certainly by sort of mid to late adolescence, it doesn't look like they can't do these things. It looks like defiance
mm,
and violence and aggression and disruption and all of those sorts of things.
mm,
These kids humiliate teachers is what happens a lot.
mm,
Is that I think they humiliate them. They expose them and humiliate them and they find their weak spots.
mm,
And because they're very good at it, because their whole lives have been they've been trained to find people's weak spots because that's where you get the communication in, and they humiliate them. And teachers don't understand the humiliation as something that they could do something with, for example. I mean, if
mm,
you, for example, you're working with a child and they say the thing that's going to just make you feel like the smallest person you've ever felt like ever in your whole life.
mm,
And they've taken you right back to your most vulnerable self. You've got a couple of options, haven't you? You've kind of got an option to hate this kid. They're
mm,
awful. What a vile child. I'm perfectly fine. I'll put my big girl boots on and kind of get back out there. And you might become aggressive, or you might become very strict, or you might become very rigid or disciplined. You might say, I want that child out of my class. You might exercise power, for example, because in schools there's a massive power differential.
mm,
So you might exercise power in a very particular way. You might become very punitive. That this child has disrespected you, has misbehaved, has not offered you the rightful authority that you deserve, etc., etc. You do all sorts of things. You could do a whole
mm,
range of things. What you're very unlikely to do is say, oh my God, like, is that anything near how that child feels? Like, if that
mm,
is anything near how that child feels or has felt in their lives, that is awful. Now, if you can get to that point, you can approach that child and or you or a colleague, a team of people can approach that child and sort of understand something about what's communicated and find a way in. You're not going to go up to them and say, I think you felt really humiliated, because they're not going to tolerate that, but you can find a way in. You, for
mm,
example, can be very careful about not humiliating them because humiliation is extraordinarily painful for them.
mm, mm.
So you could find ways to be with them that don't humiliate them, that don't make them feel small or don't make them feel like they've got no power.
As you're saying that, I'm thinking both the child and the teacher,
Absolutely.
because I'm
Yeah.
thinking about how how so often leadership in an organization doesn't participate in training.
Mm,
That's for
mm,
the people on the floor, and they through this podcast and speaking to a range of guests, that's really been
mm.
the message. Really strong message has been leadership. Everyone,
Yeah, yeah,
admin,
yeah.
yeah, drivers in
Everyone.
organization, everyone needs to be aligned, and they all
Yeah.
need to have um, they need to be supported to think about the work they do, because the first thing I think in defensiveness, when you fall prey to defensiveness, the first thing you stop doing is thinking, and you
Mm,
resort to, as I said before, kind of habitual,
yeah.
reflexive type responses. And so there needs to be a support structure that allows thinking about
Mm,
what's going on, and that has to come from the leadership of the organisation, both supporting it but also knowing themselves what's really going on.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
that
Well,
that
there's also an increase in projective processes. So everyone projects. So the
Mm.
adults who work with all of these children, young people, and families are not immune to projecting all over the place. They absolutely are projecting all over
Mm.
the place. Also, they're getting rid of the stuff that they can't tolerate. And usually that goes upwards.
Mm.
It goes to the leadership. So leadership, people in leadership are in receipt of particular kinds of projections, and we might understand these in family systems. They're in a sort of parental projective
Mm.
position. So, the managers are senior colleagues, the managers are organisational leadership, even if they're sort of unknown people. Like the NHS, for example, is an absolutely huge organisation. I only know some of my leaders. I don't, the rest are faceless.
Mm.
So you can project in all sorts of ways. I can project particular things into my managers when I'm particularly upset or distressed. My direct managers, I can do something with that. Or my supervisor, for example, and feel frustrated or disappointed with them, or like they haven't looked after me properly, or I'm angry with them, or whatever it might be. To the faceless sort of big leadership people in organizations, I have to say, what tends to happen is the vitriol of the projection is huge. You can hate them in a very different sort of way because they're distant from you. You can
Mm.
denigrate them in a very particular way because they're very distant from you. Actually, this is just ordinary stuff. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, but you do need a leadership function that can receive the projection in the way that your ground floor kind of residential social workers, teachers, whatever it is, can receive the projection from the child or young person. So the projection and the anxiety ought to go up in an organization always, and you need a leadership that's got the capacity to think, as you keep rightfully drawing attention to. Your capacity to think has to start and kind of be functional at that leadership level.
Mm.
Mm.
There's a lot of, in this space, there's a lot of talk about trauma-informed practice.
Mm.
Yeah, and trauma-informed, the term has become endemic, I guess, in its usage in populations where um, there's been significant adversity in the
Mm.
lives of the client group. But not all trauma-informed training or models or whatever is psychoanalytic or psychodynamic. Where do you think, where do you see um, the psychodynamic practice and concepts and that you're talking about, where does that sit within so-called
Mm.
trauma-informed work?
Oh, that's quite a big question, isn't it? I mean, I guess.
And it's a question without notice, I should say.
No, it's okay. I mean, it's got me thinking, but I think probably in Australia, like in the UK, psychodynamic and psychoanalytic thinking practice has kind of gone a bit out of fashion. We
Yeah.
have kept a strand of it in the UK, but it's not the core, like everywhere, CBT, behavior modification, etc., etc. The sort of core
Mm.
sort of
They're not
um
they're not trauma-informed.
no, but they're the things that are kind of offered. We get ACEs training. Everybody now gets ACEs training in residential homes, in schools. Schools often call themselves trauma informed because it's not unimportant what they're doing. But they go on a course for a day or something like that, and they learn a little bit about attachment, a little bit about trauma, the impact of trauma, and they call themselves trauma informed. Um, I don't think that that's unhelpful.
Mm.
It's just that it's a small bit of something that can kind of um I don't even know what it actually gives you. It might give
Understanding.
you a slight orientation towards something else that might be happening. So,
Yeah.
that's good. That's a good thing.
Yeah.
Um, Psychoanalytic work, psychodynamic work is essentially about the unconscious. It's about the
Mm.
unconscious. This is the reason, in lots of ways, that it's gone out of fashion. And the reason it's such difficult work is
Mm.
because it requires you to be in touch with um, the distress and the disturbance in a very particular way.
Mm.
Now, my view would be that you get much more rich information, accurate information, person-specific information, um, if you do that. That there's, essentially you something transformative happens in the internal world through relationship.
Mm.
The problem with trauma informed in its broad sense is it's like it's applied like it's a thing that you can just tell people and then it does something. It doesn't do anything.
Mm.
You have to do something with the trauma informed. And the only transformative change that happens is through relationship.
Mm.
And I think that what a psychoanalytic training or model way of thinking and working offers you is some tools to be able to use essentially yourself as the therapeutic tool. You
Mm.
are the tool. That's it. It's not a cognitive process, it's a relational felt experience.
Mm.
Um, and, for all the reasons we talked about before, that comes at a bit of a cost. However, it does make a change that is transformative as opposed to something is understood up here, but it's not felt here.
It's long been my thought about working in this space for 30 years. I've seen attachment theory has hung around, but other theories have come and gone.
Mm,
And certainly, and some are more to the fore
mm,
at certain times. So um, I think, and for example, and I'm just picking one from my 30 years of experience, the neurobiology of trauma,
mm,
that body of work, which I found really helpful in my
mm,
development as a clinical psychologist. The work of Bruce Perry,
mm,
particularly in my early years, back in the mid to late
mhm,
1990s. So I'm not having a go at it, but my observation is it's rich on knowledge or what you need to know.
mm,
It's it, it can be a bit light on what you need to do. Now I know Bruce has moved on, for example, and has the
mm,
neurosequential model of
mm,
therapeutics. But so in some senses, what I'm reflecting on is kind of before that, it gave people a lot of detailed information, but
mm,
there was not much that they could do with it, and maybe that's why Bruce, also
mhm,
moved into that. But there are other things like, ACEs
mm.
scores, and what do you do with those? Um,
Yeah, exactly.
what do you do? I think we need guiding frameworks.
Mm,
We need to be able to have a lens or even multiple lenses through which to understand what's happening for us in the work and understand what's happening. I think that's probably one of the bits that is omitted a lot now that I think about it, is the what's happening for us in
mhm,
in
mhm,
the widespread conventional
mm,
kind of trauma-informed approaches to the work.
mm,
What is
mm,
happening to us as practitioners as part of this dynamic with the people that we're
mm.
working with?
Yeah, yeah. And I suppose the psychodynamic model would say that paying close attention to what's happening to us gives you information and data that you didn't have before and you would never capture in a form or a set of experiences. Essentially you capture the ACEs experiences. It's a set of experiences. It doesn't tell you anything about how that has impacted that particular person
Mm,
and how that particular abusive event or traumatic event has met with that particular person's internal world. And
mm,
the sibling of that person might have a extremely different
yeah.
experience because they've got their own internal world that's met with this particular event. So the thing that the psychodynamic model gives you is an opportunity to use how you
Mm,
feel,
mm,
the experiences you have, to inform your understanding of a child, young person, family, and not only understand them, but then do something with it.
What do you do?
Well, you try to make some sense and through relationship, make some sense, wrap some meaning around what's being communicated. You bear the pain. They're not alone. You're traveling on something together. You create a unique language, a unique journey, a unique set of experiences. So they've got a kind of partner in trying to understand this thing that might be intolerable.
Mm,
You try to help them build up a reservoir of muscle, for want of a better word, to tolerate and live with the experience they've had, because it's never not going to have happened. They
mm,
do have to find a way to live with it and move on from it. You
mm,
help them find a way to accept something about their past and allow themselves to think of a future that can be different. You try and help them find some hope, um, trust in relationships again. Essentially, you're trying to replicate something that happens through ordinary child development, aren't you?
mm.
You mentioned infancy earlier.
Yeah, yeah.
An infant is born into the world, and there's nothing more projective than an infant.
Mm,
Essentially, that is what they do. They project their bodily experiences out into the world, into their mother,
mm,
father, whoever it is, but I'll use the word mother for ease, and it is very psychoanalytic. So, they project all of these experiences into their mother, and they don't know what any of this means.
mm,
The mother's job is to receive the thousands of communications that they get given every day, receive it, feel it, digest it, do something with it, and transform it into something that's got a bit of meaning. What does that look like in practice? It looks like a screaming baby crying because they think they're dying. And the mummy comes along and she says, "Oh, it's okay. I think you're hungry. Is that a hungry pain in your tummy?" Now, the
mm,
baby doesn't have any idea what hungry means or what tummy means or any of that. But they do know that this mummy person is trying to do something with the information that they've been given.
mm,
And then that happens thousands of times a day over
mm,
years. And then the baby develops a mind. And that's what you're trying to replicate
mm.
in a psychodynamic relationship.
It's having gone down the traditional route. I because of my primary guiding framework, the theoretical orientation I most used was attachment theory, and
Mm,
we all I always thought it was not, it kind of sat on the boundaries of psychodynamic and other developmental psychology
mm,
kinds of
mhm,
theories. So I was never, I always thought that the work that that I did was psychoanalytic in a sense,
mm,
but not deeply
mm,
psychoanalytic. But in actual fact, I arrived at that very place that you're talking about a long time ago, which is
mm,
to try and understand, think it very much about the infant and
mm.
what the infant experiences and what they're projecting. And for a lot of our young people, I think that's what we need to be turning our mind to.
Absolutely.
What the trauma occurred through neglect,
Mm,
primarily, and abuse during infancy. And a recent conversation with Peter Blake, he was very much talking about, well, what infants do have a mind. What do they
mm,
do with all of those
mhm,
experiences? How are
mm,
they stored? How are they expressed?
mm.
But
Well,
in
it's
any, but
bodily, isn't it? It's the body. And so that's where, I know there's lots of debate about where the mind is. Actually, going back to the sort of neurodevelopmental stuff you were talking, sorry, the neuropsychology stuff you were talking about, this introduction, well, not introduction, the all the work that's been done about the polyvagal system and the sort of central nervous system. And I don't know if this is true or not, but as a theory, it really helps me because I've always kind of located my mind. When I talk about the mind, I talk about it here somewhere. And I noticed a couple of years ago, I was talking to a colleague who I actually worked with in the therapeutic community, and I'd met up with him somewhere else. And we were talking, and he was talking about his mind, and he's doing this, and I'm doing this. And I'm like, oh my God. So, so where's the mind then? Like, because of course the mind
yeah,
is an abstract concept. So I started to think, and I don't know if this is true, but I've started to think that that sort of central nervous system is the mind in a
mm,
sense. And that's really helpful for me because it really helps me understand how much is located in the body.
mm,
The body is the brain is the brain and does something called thinking or something, but it's of course informed by the body. There's a sort of
mm,
process that's going on here that's kind of cyclical. And I
mm,
think that's the kind of mind. This is just my theory, by the way, but that's the sort of mind process. This is just something that helps me. And I think
mm,
partly because of what you were saying, Colby, is, lots of my training, but lots of the work that I do is working with children who were traumatized in infancy.
mm,
They've got no language for their trauma.
mm,
They've got no way of conceptualizing it as an event because it happened pre-verbal. It happened pre-memory even.
mm,
So how do they make sense of that? The reason we know they're traumatized is because it's in their body. They show us, and they
mm,
usually show us through behavior.
mm,
And usually the way they show us is by having an impact on our body.
mm,
That's how they show us.
mhm.
So this is really important stuff that I think we need to kind of uh, keep, really hold in mind. This is what, for example, teachers, social workers, police struggle to understand is that somebody who can't remember a traumatic event will still be traumatized by it.
Yes. Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. But when you were talking before, I was thinking a lot about containment,
Mm. Hmm.
and really that's um, people are a bit confused, as was I when I first came across the term containment used in this space.
Yeah.
Um, but from a psychoanalytic point of view, it's about being able to recognize, acknowledge, hold
Mm.
what the person is projecting,
Mm.
and then help them make sense of it, feed it
Yeah.
back in feedback in ways and in dosages that make it more tolerable,
Yeah.
making making the experience of hunger more
Mm.
tolerable, making
Yeah.
and Beyond, he, in Beyond's work, he talked about when we effectively contain someone, one of the outcomes of that is that they're then able to think. And you could
Well, it's
extend,
it's the prerequisite to thinking.
yeah, and then so they
Yeah.
can think and then talk about
Yeah.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so the a young person who grows up in a conventional nurturing care environment will tell
Mm.
their mum and dad that they're
Hmm.
hungry. Yeah,
Yeah.
but the prerequisite for that is way back. If they're not, well, the prerequisite for that is way back when their parent understood that they were hungry and
Absolutely.
responded to them. And so if the child is not telling anyone that they're hungry, if they're doing other things, then we have to recognize that early on,
Mm.
um, the adult wasn't an effective container. They didn't
Mm.
feel understood by the adult. And this is, I
Yeah.
guess, in part why I say understanding you got to is where we start, and it's
Hmm.
probably our most powerful intervention is to just spend time understanding what's going on here
Yeah.
for the
Yeah.
child, and then
Yeah.
our responses. can be psychological. They can be, psychological
Yeah,
strategies or whatever. But I think um, um, they're relational responses more
absolutely.
often than not. How do we? It's how we um, create a relational space that is
Mm,
therapeutic for those
mhm.
particular
Yeah,
issues for the person or the and that goes for the child in front of you. It goes for the practitioner, and it
mm,
goes for their supervisor, and it goes for the manager as well. Everyone needs, because as
yeah,
you say, everyone is in receipt of projective
mm,
experience,
mm,
and you
absolutely.
you have a choice.
Mm,
You either don't think about it
mhm,
and just respond in a procedural way,
mm,
heartless procedural way, which is interesting in the social care and child protection field. Like,
mm,
who's going to put their hand up to say,
mm.
I prefer to respond in a heartless procedural
Yeah,
way, or you have to think about it.
yeah,
But you can't immerse yourself, I guess, in the experience in that way unless
mm,
you are well supported to do
mm.
that. And
Yeah,
that's one of the things I guess we find with
yeah.
organisations, is that the support structures for the staff are not there.
No, absolutely. And that, brings us in a way back to where we started in relation to APPCIOS, which is why it was, the work that we do in organizations is to try and build within the teams these supportive structures, thinking structures, essentially a culture of thinking that means
Mm,
the containment process that you're describing there isn't just happening in an individual, it happens in an organization.
mm,
So you're trying to move the psychodynamic. I mean, you're right to kind of, it was containment I was describing, so I'm glad you picked up on it. And of course, Beyond's done the work. It's brilliant in a way, brilliant in the proper sense of the word, what he's done in relation to the container contained model. And I like to think of it as a container contained model, which is how he
mm,
described it, because it captures the dyadic relational process that we're talking about. It's not a one person process. It's not a one system process. It's a relational process.
mm,
And what we would be hoping for organisationally is that you move that out of the individual, so the mother person or the individual
mm,
clinician in the consultant room, for example, where it's really important that it happens there. But organisationally, you can build a container contained model as well, so
mm,
that the digestive process, which is what happened, essentially the container contained model is a process of digestion. And you're given something, you digest it, you do something with it, you metabolize it, and you reproduce something with meaning attached to it, as you rightly say, in a tolerable form. It is possible for an organization to have that container contain model as part of
mm,
their structure. And what that looks like is good hierarchical structures, good systems, good processes, spaces for people to think together. You might have different spaces where people think. So, for example, the management team might get some specific support to think about a relational thing that's happening or a projective process that's happening from the staff. How do they understand that in relation to the particular group of kids that they've got in their home, for example? What's that about? They might have a particular space to think about that, and then you sort of cascade that right the way through the organization, so that everybody's got a small group, perhaps individual, and large group opportunities to think. I guess because the other thing we haven't touched on in a way, Colby, is the power of the group. That's
mm,
the other thing that you capture when you do organizational work. Groups can be wonderful and they can be very reparative and they can be very destructive, as we know. So, how do you create a group, staff group and children's group, where there's reparative capacities within the group, and it's extremely powerful if you can get it right.
mm.
It can be very destructive, as we know, which is what we need to try and mitigate against.
And I think you're right. I think we started with a bit of a structure, but with a number of questions, but in probably in keeping with the topic, we just remain curious about
Mm.
well, I
Yeah,
did, and
we
you did.
meander a bit.
We meandered through
Yeah,
maintaining a stance of curiosity.
yeah.
I guess so. I actually think we covered most of what um, I had thought we might cover,
Mm.
but I found myself thinking just now about what a containing the organization looks like an effective containing organization looks like. And I wonder, before I say what I think, what I've observed, I wonder what you observe when you see an effective containing organization. What do you see?
I think, I mean, I think you've mentioned a few times now the link between containment and thinking. So I think that's what you see is a preparedness to discover, a preparedness to uh, not be an expert, to be prepared to learn something, get to know, understand. Um, you see a preparedness to think, essentially, which is that you've got a sort of steady core of something that means that when you're challenged and moved and displaced slightly from ideas or processes that you might have, that you are curious about why that's happening, why
Mm,
it's happening now in particular. Um, that you have an interest in the human people that make up your organization, because organizations aren't some magic thing. They're essentially a collection of human beings,
mm,
so that you stay connected to the humanity of the people who are your organization. Um, that you and actually, I don't think containing good organizations always get it right. I
mm,
think they make mistakes. I think that they flounder, they get lost, they continue to get frightened, they continue to feel the impact of external stresses, for example, funding cuts, all of these sorts of things. They still are living in the real world, but they've got a capacity to kind of um, shift a little bit with all of these things. Actually, this is an interesting thing because an important part of containment, I think, is something like a boundary system. That you've got
mm,
it's not like a free flowing thing, that it passes through sort of filters in this digestive model. Um, that muscle I'm talking about, like there's an impact that's felt. Things go wrong all the time,
mm,
especially when you're working with distressed, troubled children, young people, families. Things go wrong. Um, so you feel the impact of the thing that's gone wrong, but you don't collapse under the strain of the impact. And a good
mm,
sort of impact barrier, in a way, is something I always think of it a bit like, because I think in images. This is my art, it's sort of training coming through. I think in images, but um, I always imagine it to be like, do you ever remember those space hopper bouncy things? Did you ever have them when you were a kid? Like these big rubber bouncy things that you used to sit on and hold
Oh yeah,
the
yes, yes, yes,
yeah. We used to
yes.
call them space hoppers. But that thick rubber
Mm,
that can kind of take a bit of a punch.
yeah, yeah.
It
It can't
it
take me
feels
now, but
It
yeah.
can't now, no, no. But it can feel the impact of something, and it can change shape because of
Mm,
the
mm,
impact of
mm,
something, but it doesn't collapse. And the problem with, for example, too rigid organizations that might have all sorts of wonderful policies and procedures in place. I'm not anti-policy and procedure, by the way, but kind of stick to that with a rigidity. Like we've got these wonderful care plans, and everyone has to do exactly the same thing all the time. Like there's a rule that every single member of staff has to do the exact same thing and follow the care plan. I mean, apart from the fact that it's completely impossible, it's never going to happen. So you're setting everyone up to fail. The rigidity of it is brittle. So then when it's knocked, it collapses. It just shatters.
Mm.
Having none as the opposite is no good either.
No.
You do need the sort of, that's the other bit about a good functioning organization with a capacity to contain, is that they've got good ordinary structures, foundational structures in place. They've got an aim, they've got a collective, they know why they're coming into work, they know what they're doing. You've got a staff group that work together and think together, and they might not always like each other. Is the space in that organization for them to kind of, without persecuting each other, share
Mm.
what it feels like to be working alongside each other? Because that's
Mm.
really important. As I mentioned before, some of the colleagues I still work with now, those relationships were built 30 years ago in a therapeutic
Mm.
community. These are the people I trust. These are the people who know me.
Mm.
And they can say to me, hold on, Emma, you're getting that a bit wrong. That's not what you're doing there. Well, they can sort of pull me back when I'm losing my mind a little bit because they know something about me. These relationships are
Mm.
crucial in our
Mm.
professional careers, in our personal lives as well, but our professional careers, they're crucial. So you
Mm.
want a kind of culture and an environment where the staff can build uh, not always pleasant, but good quality, really robust relationships with each other where they can challenge each other, but they can help each other think because everyone loses
Mm.
their capacity to think.
Yeah.
Everybody does. So when you've lost your capacity to think, I want somebody, when I've lost my capacity to think, I want somebody behind me saying, it's all right, I can think for a bit.
Mm.
And we
Until
share
you
our
can.
capacity to think. Yeah. And
Yeah.
of course, the thinking happens in relationship. So you always need more than one mind to think. So even if it's a relationship with your own mind, it's a relationship. So thinking is a relational
Process.
experience process. Yeah, it's a better word. Thinking is a relational process.
Mm. I'd love to talk to you for another 15 minutes or so about that
Mm.
too, Emma.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, so the word that really stands out for me when I think of organisations that, and I can think of one in particular that appeared, I had representatives on this podcast earlier on, is the humanity of it.
Mm.
Of
Yeah.
that they're good human beings who just set out to understand and respond
Yeah.
therapeutically to people
Mm.
at
Yeah.
all levels, including
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
people that you don't like, for example, birth parents.
Mm.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
a lot
Yeah.
more humanity shown to birth parents would not go astray because when the children turn 18, the birth parents are still there. Um,
Absolutely. I've met lots of parents, Colby, and I don't know if I've ever met any. I'm sure they exist, but it's few and far between that you meet parents that are intentionally harming, as in setting out to harm their children.
yeah,
Birth parents, as we know, birth parents, parents who may even still have contact with their children, they they're usually there's troubled children and infants inside of them, and I don't
mm,
know at what age we sort of switch off our compassion.
mm,
I think in boys it's younger than girls. We have less tolerance for boys who are troubled than we do for girls who are troubled. But then you get to adulthood, and we struggle as as a culture here, maybe there to remain compassionate
yeah,
towards these people who, they've already had the worst thing happen because their children aren't with them.
mm,
But, we struggle to have compassion for their pain. And, they might have
mm,
done horrific things to their children, but it doesn't mean we can't have compassion for their pain either.
yeah, yeah.
Mm.
Thank you, Emma. I know the evening is progressing on for you. It's the
It
morning
is.
now. The sun is up. I started in the dark, and now it's light. I suspect you started in the dark, and I suspect
I
it's just
started
as
in the
dark.
dark. Yeah, I started in the dark, and it's still dark, Colby. But bed is
Yeah,
calling.
yeah, yeah. All right. Well, I won't keep you from that. So thank you very much for coming on. I've really
No, it's
enjoyed the
been a pleasure.
conversation.
Me
Yeah.
too. It's been an absolute pleasure.